Without further ado, I'll invite the first speaker, the referring team, to begin the
Yeah. How does this work? Okay. Slide 3, 2, 1. When a kid is making an Instagram account and comes across age verification, all they have to do is run to their mother's purse and get their credit card, and now they're exposed to even more harmful content that is exclusively catered towards the audiences above the age of 16. My speech is going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to prove some notes and setup. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why this policy is just not very effective. Thirdly, I'm going to explain to you why we get better safety on outside the house. And lastly, I'm going to prove a principle on privacy. Okay. Firstly, on some setup then. 1, what's the comparative we support? We support a stronger algorithmic regulation for everyone on social media, regardless of age, right? This looks like stricter regulations of graphic and sexual content. This looks like regulations on hate speech. Note that this is the likely comparative because A, governments have limited regulation capacity, and it requires political capital to implement regulation, which means this is going to be relatively mutually exclusive, which just happens to a far lesser extent on cybergating. But B, because the public has an incentive to care and pressure the government and make social media a safer place for kids in general, and the government therefore just needs to show that something is being done in response on either side of the house. Okay, secondly, in the world in which NEG needs to support. And I think it's a world where governments require media companies to implement some form of age verification. This is probably to meet some threshold of certainty in terms of the identities of users, but I think it is largely up to the companies on how they implement these. 2 reasons. A, because they have greater capacity to implement these because they just have greater technological advancement, and B, because social media companies can just lobby and have lots of political influence, which means it's very difficult to pass extremely strict identity verification laws. I'm going to expand on this later. I'll take a point if you have one. Okay, now I'm going to talk about efficacy, right? Note here this point is a logical priority to start negating unlocking the impacts of having safer children on media and having better accountability for all users on the social media. 1, this regulation is going to be done incredibly poorly. A, this is going to be presumably done by companies and mandated by the government, right? Which means that these companies have an incentive to maximize the amount of users that are using these social media platforms, right? This is because the more users that are on your social media platform, the more, this compounds, attracts more individuals to go and download your app, which means then that these companies have an incentive to maximize the amount of users on there. Notably, the young demographic who we're trying to regulate on side negating are extensively exposed to social media, right? They grow up in an incredibly digitized age, which means that when this policy is incredibly effective, social media companies will lose huge amounts of their viewer bases, which obviously means that this is probably going to decrease the amount of profit margin that each social media company is going to receive, which means these companies have an incentive to make this policy incredibly tokenistic, which is make it incredibly easy to bypass these regulations in the first place. But B, because it is just incredibly difficult to scrutinize and further build up regulation on side negating, because it is just easy to shift the blame now onto the parents for having their credit card information readily accessible to kids, or it's easy to shift the blame on the children for bypassing these regulations that already exist. And I think that is the point in which social media companies just do not have to have the same degree of accountability as they do on outside the house, which I'll expand later. But note here that also it's just that governments are just bad at assessing complex verification systems, and also the public just thinks that the solution already exists, that something is really being done by these companies in order to implement safety laws, all of which means it just probably isn't going to be very effective. Secondly, children can incredibly easily bypass these systems, right? One, because we live in an incredibly digitized age. Kids go to school and you have other kids on social media who probably also have an incentive to bypass social media because it is just something that is so culturally proximate to a lot of individuals, because it is just cool to be on Instagram, right? But B, because kids are just generally a lot more tech savvy because, we grow up in an age in which you are learning to use devices in schools. Literally everyone just understands how to do two-step verification. Kids are not stupid, right? But C, it's just that this is done all behind the backs of the parents, which means it's just incredibly difficult without confiscating your child's phone in order for your parents to actually control what your kid does on social media, all of which just means that kids are going to very easily bypass this, which means it's just not going to be very effective. I'll take your point.
If I am a third-party age verification company and want to keep my government contract, why do I not have an incentive to make the verification process as good as I possibly can?
Okay, a few things to say here. One, I think that specifically, it is just unclear as to why the same age verification company is going to be allocated to all of the social media companies. And note that because social media companies have incredible amounts of lobbying power, because literally everyone, they have so much political influence, they have so much influence over what society thinks. I think that social media companies are probably just going to lobby for this deregulation on your side of the house anyways. Okay, secondly, in terms of safety, I'm going to characterize social media company incentives a little more here. One, they want to deregulate their algorithms. This looks like minimal flagging of content and just very lenient policy when it comes to reporting a really offensive and damaging posts. This is true because A, regulation is just incredibly difficult to do, right? You have to spend billions and billions of dollars coding and filtering systems. You need to maintain a literal AI that constantly needs to teach it to filter arbitrary cases of policy violation. And B, deregulation just increases the concentration of sensationalized content that attracts clicks and views. And note here, that means you just have more money, and that means you have more reviewer base on their side of the house, which means then that social media is just fast-paced. These videos that are probably going to be flagged on our side of the house are just going to attract a lot of attention because you have limited attention span, and in 20 seconds these are the ones that trigger the visceral responses and are people just they tend to get a lot more engagement because of curiosity, right? Okay, secondly, how does the algorithm regulation how is it comparatively better on our side of the house? One, because social media companies under age verification laws are just no longer accountable for children, right? Because this is especially harmful for the media because A, they have an incentive to regulate on our side of the house, they have an incentive to regulate and just it's just better on our side. And B, I think that I've talked about this before, but the blame is just going to be shifted onto parents and side negating. And note here if our first point stands, and if we're able to prove that children are able to just access social media on both sides of the house, this means that kids are just going to be increasingly exposed to violence. That is particularly harmful. But two, is that social media just gets far worse for literally everyone, right? Because even people over the age of 16, it's just incredibly harmful to be exposed to graphic content and hateful and sexually explicit content. Because A, the social media is just algorithmic, right? If you engage with harmful content, that is just I've proven why you will do so because of curiosity. That means that people are just going to end up in incredibly harmful echo chambers. And B, because people just form a lot of their beliefs based on social media. So this means that even if there are counterbalancing forces and counterbalancing narratives not to believe what you see on social media, literally everyone is on social media. Literally everyone watches Instagram Reels, which means that you're rarely thinking critically on the media because people access it as a means of escapism, right? The impacts of this. One, people are just more polarized and more radical and incredibly a lot more hateful insofar as the media companies just do not need to regulate a lot of their content because they have age verification there, and it is something that is tokenistic, and people just see it as something that is already being done about children. And two, because all of a sudden, when people turn 16 and get onto the media, it is just very dangerous. They're exposed to everything. They're exposed to a lot of sexually explicit content. It's just not regulated and filtered out. We're more likely to get this on our side of the house. We're likely going to get a safer media. Okay, now that I'm going to briefly run through this privacy principle. Note here that people feel less safe disclosing their age and tastes and their literal identity to media companies that are absolutely massive, right? But secondly, you cannot avoid social media. It is incredibly difficult to opt out insofar as literally everyone communicates using social media. Literally everyone is on fast-paced media, right? This means that in their best case, where you believe that this regulation is actually done well, then you have to necessarily believe that social media companies would have access to so much information and data about literally everyone over the age of 16, right? This is credit card details, this is ID, this is your gender, right? This is things that you usually don't have to tell social media, that you have to disclose on their side of the house if they want to prove efficacy, right? That is bad. That is when you have things like increased exposure to attacks and leaks. That is way worse because now you're going to be traced back to in real life people, which means then you just feel a lot less safe on the media. You should not be disclosing your information to these terrible, terrible companies.
speaker for their speech and invite the first speaker of the meeting.
Do I need to stand?
You can stand there.
Okay, great. I don't think that F can give us all of these reasons as to why social media companies are so incredibly profit-driven, and then also tell us that they are going to be the best people at regulating themselves. I think it's very clear that the only way to achieve any kind of true child harm prevention is through the government, is through government regulation, and as I'll tell you, the only way to make that regulation effective is to have age verification systems. Okay, I'm going to start with some setup, then I'm going to give you 2 points. Firstly, on why we think this is the only way to do harm prevention for kids, and secondly, why we think this forces accountability on social media companies when there's age verification. I'll do some rebuttal throughout. Starting then with some setup. Firstly, why do I think age verification systems are actually quite effective? We heard 5 reasons from F, mainly why this isn't true. Firstly, because kids are just able to steal things from their parents. I think this is actually quite hard because generally these are actually like important documents that are kept in safe places, but also most parents also exist on social media platforms, and they're probably using their own identification in order to do this. I think therefore if your parent is already on social media, you can't go and use their passport. If your parent then makes a new account, they can see that you've gone and used their passport. Secondly, we heard that kids are quite tech savvy. I think that maybe they might be like comparatively tech savvy, but they're probably nowhere near as tech savvy as the actual third-party companies that we think are often implementing these systems, as the people hired by the government whose entire job is to design an age verification system to be able to stand up to kids who know how to code a little bit. I think we're very good at like building tech things that don't get hacked immediately. Thirdly, we have the idea that this is done behind the backs of parents. I'm not entirely clear why this makes it any worse. I think that parents always have like little power to watch exactly what their kids are doing because they don't have access often to their entire social media accounts. I think this doesn't have much change. Fourthly, we hear that social media companies have a lot of lobbying power. I think that in a world where like governments are choosing to do regulation, where we see that they often already are or are starting to do so, or like just in a world where they have some kind of regulations in place to protect kids, which I think is in most countries, I think when that regulation already exists, social media companies probably have little lobbying power, but also at the point with the government where we, I think, have sufficient fiat to be able to say the government is going to go and implement age verification systems. I'm unclear why the social media companies are able to like lobby their way out of this, and the government somehow like claiming they're going to do age verification while not actually doing it. I think at this point you probably just go and hire the best third-party company who have to do this. Finally, we hear that governments are just bad at regulation. I think there are lots of things that governments can do well in regulation, especially when there's public pressure, because they've said that this is a policy they're going to do. I'll take that POI now.
Your best is teenagers now get exposed to all of social media at the age of 17 with less protection. Why is this any better?
Because I would rather have like people exposed to social media at the age of 17 with no protection than the age of 7 with no protection. Like, I think it's clear that the older you are when you're exposed to social media, the better. But also, I think I'll explain to you why, in most cases, people who like are exposed earlier just have a bunch less harm put onto them. Okay. Additional mix in why age verification systems are effective. Firstly, we told you this in our POI. Third-party systems have a high incentive to get it right because they want to keep the government contract. That's the thing that they're going to be like assessed on. Secondly, I think that parents largely don't want to do illegal things. Most parents want to restrict their kids from using social media, and so want a push from the government saying, or like social pressure saying, actually, there is social pressure to stop your kids using this. I think this backs them up, and this gives them the legitimacy to say to their kids, no, you can't go and do this. Take steps to like hide the passport on the top shelf or something. I'm sure it's not that hard. Okay. But thirdly, I think lots of kids just don't want to go behind their parents' back to steal their ID from them, especially if they haven't already started using social media, which we think is the case maybe like after 5 years. We're now talking about kids who have never been on social media. I think to take that massive step to like go on social media when you're not already addicted to it is quite hard to do. Okay. Next piece of setup, what do we think the regulatory regulatory environment looks like currently for social media? I think in lots of cases, there are government regulations that say you can't start using social media till a certain age. There's like restrictions on what you can see on there. There's restrictions on what kind of data they can collect on you, how addictive they can make the outcomes, etc. I think also in lots of cases, there is no regulation. At this point, social media companies are largely creating arbitrary limits for themselves, like you can't use Instagram until you're 13, which looks like you're just going and ticking a box, largely because that removes them from any social or legal liability, because they can say, oh, everyone's on our platform over 13, we don't need to do child protection. Moving then to my first point on why I think we now uniquely are able to make child restrictions effective. Okay. Note that as I told you, in lots of countries there are social media restrictions implemented. I think these only work when we're able to have these things. I think because in a world where there is not a government mandate to do age verification systems, then social media companies are largely able to create their own systems, which, like, as I told you, probably just looks like ticking a box. So all of the reasons F gave us about why social media companies want access to children, want access to their time, they're likely to make it very easy to get around so children still come and go onto their systems. Okay. I think but also note that they are able to do this because I think that as much social pressure as F wants to claim exists on social media companies, they are always able to just create another system that they claim is going to work better but actually doesn't. No, these systems are usually quite complicated and the get arounds are not immediately clear. They take time to work out. They take time to gather a response to from the public. By the time you've gone to all that pressure to create pressure onto social media companies, they're able to just then go and create a new system that they claim is marginally better but still doesn't do the job. They're thus able to perpetually continue to access children. Okay, why do we uniquely therefore need government to intervene? Because they can do this through bans, they can do this through restrictions, and they can make this effective using age verification systems that I've told you why they're going to work, why they're going to prevent a large number of kids from actually being able to access this. Note that I think this is especially powerful because as soon as you have a sufficient number of kids who are no longer going on social media, there is now an effect where, because like social media is such a social phenomenon, when you have a large majority of kids that are no longer using it, the social pressure on the remaining kids to continue using it starts to deplete because there are less and less people, there's less and less reason for them to go on and communicate with people. I think we get a snowballing effect where you have fewer and fewer kids who exist on social media. I think we have a snowball where parents feel increasingly emboldened to prevent their kids from going on, to put on restrictions, etc. Okay, why do we want to stop kids going on social media? I think Ash gave you a bunch of these outcomes really well, but it's just really bad. It's purposely addictive. It's really bad for their brains. We think if they get shown lots of really bad content, the more that we can prevent them, the more that we can make sure that they're actually having restrictions that are supposed to exist for like teen accounts or child accounts applied to them, the better. Okay. Secondly then, why would we think we force accountability onto social media companies? In this point I'm talking about where we have like environments where there is very low regulation, where there is not a lot of bans, where social media companies are largely allowed to do whatever they want. I think currently, as I told you, they set arbitrary limits. I think in a world where the bans still don't exist, but where governments at the very least require them to do like age verification systems, I think this now means that the companies, like probably because they're quite effective, now no longer have an arbitrary age 13 limit because they still want to access all of the kids, but instead now like have to have the kids sign up as being 12, right? They have to have on their server and on their system that this is a 12-year-old who is using social media. What does this now mean? I think it now means that when people point out the harms from social media, when these cases go to court, as we see them increasingly doing in public pressure being put onto these companies, they can no longer say, oh, this kid ticked a box that said they were 13, therefore we don't have to do child prevention techniques. Because I think these companies now clearly know that there are kids operating on these systems and there is a bunch more public pressure existing on them to make those systems good. I think this looks like people now actually being able to go to their lawmakers and saying, look, you need to go and regulate these guys. We thus get even more regulatory environments we think are particularly effective on our side. I think this looks like more of these court cases succeeding. I think this looks like more social media companies simply having to accept that by themselves, because they don't want to look like big evil players, that they have to do some kind of regulation on kids. I think that's a world where we immediately wing because we get the kids that are using social media in a much better environment. Thank you.
Let's thank the speaker for his speech and invite up the second speaker.
It is clear that Negation do not understand how the tech industry works. They do not understand the inherent biases that these social media companies have, and they do not understand the insane amount of capacity that they have to do this ineffectively. A couple things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to be talking a lot about efficacy and why it's actually not going to be as effective as I tell you. Secondly, I'm going to talk about public incentive to create pressure on the government and these companies. And thirdly, I'm going to extend on why it's really bad that kids at 17 suddenly get on social media in their very best case. Okay, let's talk about efficacy, because I have a couple main pushes here. Firstly, they tell you that it's going to be hard to bypass because you can't use your parents' passport because, like, they've already used it on their social media, right? A couple things here. One, I'd say it's very unclear why they suddenly get around all the things we tell you about why social media companies have an incentive to do this badly, right? Note that it is quite a lot of, like, work and it's quite a high burden for social media companies to set up this whole system in which they track individual credit cards and track who's using it and whatnot. I think Lucy gives you tons of reasons why social media companies have a bad and have no incentive to do this, but let's say they do, right? Let's say that this push actually stands. I think it's pretty easy to say that, hey, parents have multiple credit cards. You might have a credit card, you might have a debit card, you might have other things. Two, it's likely that these companies will only require one form of identification, right? I.e., either your passport or your ID or your credit card, any one of these stand. Therefore, if your parents has used your credit card, has used their credit card, you can just use their passport, right? I think this is pretty easy to believe. But three, we're saying a lot of people have multiple social media accounts, right? So therefore, it is believable that it is you are able as a child, as a person, to have multiple of them. Therefore, there must be some mechanism by which a person can have more than one attached to them, right? They tell you here that the parent will at least know, then they'll be alerted if the kid has created an account, right? I think we tell you why kids are far more tech savvy. It's fairly easy to take your mom's phone at the same time you're taking a credit card, create the account, and then delete the notification. I think this is pretty easy to believe. They tell you that they can just hide it on the top shelf. These are not toddlers who are trying to make social media accounts. This is a 12-year-old. I think a 12-year-old boy is likely going to be as tall as his mom or higher, right? I don't think this is very good analysis. Okay, secondly here, they tell you this massive push that these governments are going to hire third-party companies, and this is going to be amazing effectiveness, right? A couple things here. One, I think we tell you why these governments are incentivized to let the social media companies decide how they want to enforce this, right? Because a couple of reasons. One, note that these social media companies have a lot of political lobbying power. Like Lucy tells you, they're very rich, they have a lot of networks, they're very much in touch with these governments. We tell you why it's far better for them to be allowed to reinforce it themselves. I think this tells you why, right? But then even if you don't believe this, note that these social media companies exist from a lot of different owners and exist in a lot of different countries, right? I.e. the owners of TikTok are not going to be okay with the same third-party company reinforcing and regulating their platform as the owners of Meta, as the owners of Snapchat, right? Therefore, I think it's easy to believe that, one, the government will not be enforcing this directly because they don't have the technical capacity to do this, but B, these tech companies won't support them in doing this, but C, these third-party companies are likely, even if they exist, going to be separate from the government. They're not going to be chosen by the government, they're going to be chosen by these individual social media companies, right? What this means then, why is it not going to be effective for these third-party companies? Because you think you need to do some analysis here about what the tech industry actually looks like. Because they make it sound as though these third-party companies are sent down from heaven and they're angels who are all-knowing, right? What do these tech industry people actually look like? They look like people who went to university with the CEOs of these tech companies. They look like people who attend conferences with these tech company CEOs. They look like people who go out for lunches with these tech company CEOs and lobby them and ask, can I get a job in your place? What is your company doing? Is there any potential for me to be freelanced here, right? These are people who work in the same industry. These are people who go to the same events. These are very, very closely connected networks of people. If you look at these third-party companies they tell you about, note they give you no analysis about what these third-party companies look like, why they're going to have the capacity to do this, but you have to believe if they have the capacity to do this, that means they have people who are very highly trained, very highly skilled, who are in this upper class, very highly trained group of people. These people have an incentive to want to be hired by these companies. These people have the capacity to be able to influence these companies and vice versa. Therefore, these people are going to be biased. These people are not going to be perfect. These people are going to be heavily influenced by these tech companies. We don't hear enough analysis about why this is not going to happen. This is very likely to happen. Okay, thirdly here, let's talk about, they say that the parents are going to tell their kids not to do this, and therefore the kids are not going to do this. I think any parent in the room can say why this is not good analysis. If there's one way to get a kid to do something, it's to tell them not to do it. And I think another thing here to note is that it's unclear as to why parents are going to care so much about this. Because note that social media companies already have age restrictions, and parents don't care. Parents do not care if their kid is on Instagram, even though they might logically know, oh yeah, Instagram I guess has a 13 year 13 age limit, but my kid's 12 and is still on it. This is because I think parents generally have like a high level of trust in their child, right? They believe that like, okay, my child probably knows what they're doing, and also I'm seeing my child, so if they were to go down like a terrible rabbit hole, I'm going to be able to like tell, and I'm going to be able to pull them out of it. Also, note that parents are like very busy. They are like people with like working lives. They often like work 9 to 5. And then when they come home, they have like to cook, they have to clean, they have to take care of their kids. It's unclear as to why like so much of their already limited capacity is going to go towards enforcing these policies on their kids and making sure their kids like staying on social media and like making sure their passports are hidden at all times, their credit cards are hidden at all times, making sure they're constantly checking what accounts have been created with their credit cards. But B, it's unclear as to why they're going to care so much as to do this in the first place, why they are going to like try to like convince their kid of this thing that they probably don't care as much about because they just don't see it as that big of an issue as we already see in the status quo. Did they tell you that kids are not going to want to lie to their parents, right? Okay, I think I already tell you that they first have to prove why parents are going to care about this. But B, like, kids don't care about lying to their parents, especially about something that the kid themselves sees as not big of a deal. Why is this kid not going to see this as that big of a deal? Because A, kids don't see social media as a problem, because the harms of social media are very hard to understand, they're very nuanced, they're very complex, they require a lot of analysis and thinking on a psychological level about the long-term harms this has. Your 10-year-old kid who wants to have a Snapchat account to talk to their friends is not going to be doing this. They see this as like, oh my gosh, I want to have this messaging account. Even if their mum cares, they're going to be like, mum doesn't understand, all the kids at school have this, I'm going to do it, right? That leads me to like that reason, right? They're not going to see this as a big deal because it's going to be a very normalized culture. We already see this in the status quo. It's unclear as to why this would go away suddenly. But I think it's fair to say that like even if one kid has it, then it becomes incredibly tempting for other kids to then have like social media, right? Because they want to be like part of the cool kids. They want to know what's going on in the world. They want to have access to these trends, these viral things. Note that social media is where culture is predominantly shared among young people. Young people have a really, really high incentive to be part of these group chats. They don't want to be left out. Your social life is so much of your life as a kid. They have such a high incentive to get over this and tell you they have such a high capacity because at the end of the day, lying to your parents is not that hard. Sorry to all the parents in the room. Okay. Secondly then, they tell you that like the public is going to have a really high incentive to like make sure the government is doing this well. A, the public has a very low capacity to understand what is being done well. The public does not have statistics on which kids, how many kids who are underage are on social media. Very, very unclear about how the public is going to know if this is being done well or not, right? But then B, we tell you that even if they do, that incentive just goes down so much on their side because they tell you that loosely, why in the status quo, the public does have this incentive, this would likely result in regulation, but because they're already going to be headlines in the news of like, oh, the government is doing this massive thing to like get rid of like social media for like kids, the public has lots of other things to lie about, they're going to move on. It's very unclear why this is going to like remain to be such a high incentive to the public to the point at which they're going to do this research to care about it, right? But I'm going to make my substantive contribution and tell you why it's really bad, even in their absolute best case, if you believe all of their analysis, when kids turn 16, they're now going to be, A, on this, because they're going to have the incentive to get social media for all the reasons I tell you, they're going to have an increased capacity. But B, this is so much worse, because now, in the span of 1 year, you've just got all these kids who've got all of this content exposed to them all at once. They did not build up the media literacy over those 16 years. They did not build up the tools and capacity to deal with this. This is incredibly harmful. They have to deal with this.
Speak for their speech and invite us to speak from the
The affirming side cannot claim that companies have unlimited lobbying power over governments and therefore will never be restricted when countries like Australia have literally done this under 16 ban, right? We think they've chosen a very US-centric framing in this debate. We think that governments are able to put in place this pretty simple ban that most people we think will agree on. Okay. 2 questions when rebutting the affirming case, right? Firstly, we have this question of whether this ban will be effective or not, and this looks like kids being able to sneak around parents and stuff. And then secondly, on this question of whether companies will actually let governments regulate them to some extent. Okay, starting with what we heard the most material about, which is whether kids will be able to sneak around their parents or not, right? Okay, we heard this we basically heard 3 really big 3 mechs on how easy it is for a child to just get their parents' credit card information and use it to make a social media account, right? Okay, this doesn't work because they've told you, maybe your parent has multiple IDs, or maybe you make another account attached to your parent, or these companies will only have one form of ID required. We think that every time someone is able to get around this ban, that is a new loophole that is then closed, right? We don't actually need to prove to you that there will never be a loophole in this ban, but as we will be able to prove to you, governments have an incentive to enforce this ban, and therefore every loophole will eventually be closed. There will be a slow and steady effect where there are less kids on social media overall, and that pushes less kids to get social media if they don't already have it. Okay. And then yeah, I'll take the PI.
Social media is evolving so incredibly fast. Why does the government have the incentive and capacity to constantly be passing new bills to protect against these laws?
We think that it doesn't have to be new bills, right? It just has to be a person working to see if how kids are getting on social media and then stopping them from doing so. It doesn't have to be a new bill every time. Okay. And then secondly, we heard this idea that the public eye is essentially ineffective in terms of making sure that kids are staying off social media, right? We heard that if there's a headline on the news saying that everyone under 16 is now off social media, the public does not then have an incentive to actually check if children under 16 on social media is there or not. We just think this is not true, because if there's a headline saying that every kid under 16 is not able to be on social media, and then you go on social media and you see a 15-year-old on their Snapchat story saying I'm here, lol, then people will be able to see that this ban is not working, right? This is constant pressure on the government to do this better. No. And then, okay. And then this moves me on to my idea of onto this question of whether companies will just do this ban really badly, and therefore because they don't want to lose this market of young people that are on their companies, right? That are on social media platforms, right? We just think that this market is not big enough to make the companies have the incentive to go around this really big government ban that is very clear saying kids under 16 should not be on your platform, right? We think that means that companies have to explicitly do something illegal every time they hire a third party that lets some kids onto social media sneakily, right? We just don't think that market of young people is big enough to push companies to do this, because companies don't want to do something so explicitly illegal, right? It's just a big risk for them. We think that there are enough people on social media, right? We think that every adult is already on social media. We think they have a big enough market. We think that every time someone turns 16, they will then go join social media. So we don't think that the companies have a massive incentive to go around the government, right? Yeah. And then secondly, we think we have enough in this debate to say that governments will actually want to do this policy and will have an incentive to somewhat push it. We don't think this is a case that they can run. Okay. And yeah, this yeah. Okay. And then lastly, this idea that some parents just won't care if their kids on social media, and kids are just born sneaky, teenage rebellion, all that. Okay, we think that even if we aren't able to get every single teenager, every single 15-year-old off social media immediately, we do still make a massive impact on the negating side of the house, right? Because let's do some weighing here. All the affirming side has been able to tell you is that public pressure is enough to make these companies choose not to let children, to monitor content that goes out to children, and that in itself is enough, right? As we've told you at Thomas, it is simply, this is simply ineffective. We think every day children are exposed to violent content on social media, right? It is clearly better if they're not on social media in the first place. So this moves me on to this idea that even if we aren't able to get every kid off social media, if we're able to get some kids off social media, that is a big enough impact, right? Because now, when this policy goes into place, this means that every time you're on social media, you're go explicitly doing something that is illegal, doing something that is really bad, right? We think maybe this just looks like being on social media, being seen the same way that we see vaping, or the same way that we see like sneaking out of your house, right? Even if these are things that most teenagers do like once in a lifetime, we don't think this is like as bad as socially it being normal for children to be on social media. We think this change is big enough for us to win this debate. Okay, and then and we think they like ignored all of this nuance in our case. Okay, and then secondly, and then these two minor points that we heard, which were around kids being 17, getting social media for the first time in their life, and suddenly they're like seeing people getting beheaded, right? Okay, we just don't think this is a massive impact because we think currently kids are actually exposed to a lot of violent content on social media, right? People are able to just like circumvent any restrictions that get put in place, right? Like people don't say rape, they say grape instead on social media. That is like a very common thing that people do. Therefore, we think that like this like massive impact that they're trying to explain to you, that once kids turn 17, they suddenly go on the social media that is like the Wild West, is largely not true, right? We think this change is not big enough. And then secondly, we think that at 17, we're probably in a better mental state than when you are 7 and are exposed to violent social media content, and therefore we think this is not a massive, massive harm. Okay, and then on this very minor point that I think the affirming side has realized is very minor, data privacy, we think that social media companies low-key have all your data anyway, right? We don't think this is like a massive change. We think that social media companies, every time you like click on an ad and like buy something with your credit card, they most likely are able to get this information anyway. Like data encryption, like we just don't think like we're able to get a massive change on data privacy on their side of the house. And if they want to make this a point, they have to make out to you exactly why this is really, really important. Okay, now moving on to my split, which is regarding like the fact that even under our side of the house, because we have fiat in this debate to explain that the government set this policy, we set a precedent of social media companies being somewhat regulated, right? And I think the affirming side actually gave you some really valuable like making out as to why social media companies are able to kind of like do a lot of things like whenever they want to without having a lot of regulations on them, right? Firstly, because like public pressures on them are like not that real, because like no one's gonna get off WhatsApp, right? Maybe your work group chat is on it. Like people aren't able to regulate social media companies as a public effectively, right? But we think the governments do actually have a unique ability to like have to follow the public's wishes, right? Like they're elected there. Like if you're unhappy with the government, it's really easy to see where you have to go in order to explain to in order to express this anger. And we think that like under our side of the house, because this relationship has been made really clear, it has been shown that the publicly elected government is more powerful than a company run by a bunch of shareholders. Therefore, we set a precedent where social media companies are able to be elected, and Mark Zuckerberg doesn't just like walk away when thousands of parents tell him that you've like massively harmed our children, and this is a really, really big impact. Thank you.
Speaker for this speech and invite the third speaker.
This is extremely telling about the way in which negating tries to rebut our points and tries to get around our points by only adding more contingency and nuance. It doesn't deal with our actual responses that we gave to you and that we tell you apply to their instances anyway. They didn't deal with our actual case. They didn't deal with the actual nuance that we gave, the actual responses that we gave them. That was where they lost the debate. I'm going to break down all of their contingencies, why they never failed to prove them, even if they did, why they still lose this debate. I'm going to answer 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, on what the comparative actually looks like, because notice they tried to strawman this and took a very extreme approach, but if you buy their analysis, you have to buy our one as well. Secondly, on how safety actually changes. I'll be very charitable here, and I'll prove to you why, even in the worst case where we lose like 16-year-olds and below, why we went on the rest. And then thirdly, on the principle of privacy and why it is the most important point, why it's a prerequisite for any of the benefits that they want, why we push this the hardest. On the comparative quickly then, I think that they try to tell us that the alternative that we get is that social media does it themselves and it looks like a tick box that people just choose. We have two responses to this for why this isn't the case. Firstly, we tell you that it's done by the government because it is the most effective way. They have the most power. People respect them the most. Notice that you don't have to even buy this from us though, because they gave you this analysis at first and down the line in the very first place why this is the most likely way it's implemented. Therefore, we think it is fair given that the same incentives for regulation is the same. I think though, secondly, even if it is done by companies, I'm going to prove to you why it's still done far better than like age verification, and that the scale is far better. Because notice at the top of the speech that we literally impact every single person in our world, that in our very worst case, we are literally impacting everyone, and that any of the impacts that we can get is extended to a far greater degree. But I think B, they never disproved our preemptive efficacy push on why it's actually done badly on their side. They tried to waffle their way around it. They didn't do this through contingency. What does safety look like on either side? They try to do at a very top level that it's done by third-party companies and that they have very great incentives. But notice that they never made the logical leap for why these third companies are the ones that are being used by the government in the very first place. We add two responses here. Firstly, we tell you that just very intrinsically, it is harder to do it through third-party companies because of the ways that these companies work. You have to like email through different people. It's just a very more complicated process, even if that's marginal compared to going through the social media companies themselves. But I think secondly, the kind of ways that that the government consults the issue is that they go through to experts that aren't necessarily in the government that have experience in this area. Notice that they look like people that know the people in social media companies. These are the people who likely have been in it in former times, and therefore they have a bias towards them. Even if that's not a bad bias, it means that they think very highly of these companies, and therefore they're likely to believe that these are the most likely options. You shouldn't go through third-party alternatives. They never prove why the government is the most likely alternative. It's too late for them to do that. Let's go on to efficacy though, because they tried to tell us that the method is going to reduce the amount of children on social media and why that's so bad. We already told you, and I don't need to restate this because you have this in your notes, that the government will do it badly and that social media do it badly. But let's just give them the contingency that perhaps third-party companies do it and that it is done so well that the incentives still remain. We tell you three things. Firstly, that they never sufficiently dealt with that children are curious, that they have very complex minds, that seek answers, and therefore they're likely to go anyway. The best responses that they gave you is that like parents are online anyway, they understand the harm, that they don't want to steal from their parents, and that they can just put it on the top shelf. I know. We already gave you all the responses at Krisha for why this isn't the case, but I think in the very top level, the kind of children that are likely to be deterred and that are scared of their parents, or at least of the consequences, are the ones that know how bad social media is anyway. Because notice that's symmetrical. Social media is like equal on both sides in terms of what's actually on the platform. I think that means then that these aren't the actors that we care about, because these are the ones that were deterred either way, because the main incentives remain. These aren't the ones that we cared about. But I think their next response is that our next response is that children can hear from other people. That is to say that things spread in schools and that one person on social media is good enough. Because notice, they tell us that you get a compounding effect and that you get less people on social media and therefore the people remaining are less likely to be on it. But we characterize these kinds of people that they never dealt with, because we told you it looks cool if you're the one on social media when nobody else is, because they are very curious and they live in schools. But I think secondly, it doesn't deal with their analysis, because they told you that social media is very addicting. If you buy that, that means that these children can't just get off, even in our worst case, that they are addicted. That is something that exists. That means then, word spreads, one person in a school is enough to get all the harms that they have to deal with on their side. That is very bad. I think thirdly though, they never sufficiently deal with the debate outside of a vacuum, because they don't understand that there are other sources of this very bad content. For example, the news and all of these things you can get through other places that mitigates the harms even in our very worst case. Let's deal with our positive material though, because we told you two things, that filtering becomes a lot worse and that it hits very hard at 17 because now you're exposed to it all at once in their absolute best case when you buy all of their contingencies. In their very first place though, we think that filtering becomes a lot worse because it looks like people thinking that age verification has done the work and therefore it's very more likely that it becomes a lot more worse content. They never dealt with this, and I'll note why this is very bad, because on scale, this literally impacts everyone on the social media platform, that literally every single person, regardless of whether they're 16 or below, is impacted by this. This is very bad. But secondly, we tell you that the magnitude is a lot worse, because they try to tell you that children are the most vulnerable stakeholders. We tell you that they live in a very closeted environment where they have like parental care and parental help. Those aren't the people that are the most vulnerable. It's the people that are after the age of 17, these actors that we add nuance to, the ones that don't have the kind of support systems and necessarily are online and are addicted by their own analysis. But I think the reason that they never deal with the fact that it hits a lot harder at 17, because the magnitude is just a lot worse when you have no conception on it in their absolute best case. Notice this relies on the fact that they stop every single person. They conceded that even if they get a margin, that's enough. Therefore, this doesn't even matter. Before I push our principle, though, I'll take a point.
If age verification is so effective, if I as a society can see that every kid around me still uses social media, why is this going to make social media worse?
We already told you at first and down the line that if age verification is in place, then it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, because the people online that have an incentive to get people addicted believe it is because they want to. They are very biased people. These are the kind of people that then just like have a reason to make their content worse because they can just point at the fact there's an age verification, we have less like responsibility on us. Why is the principle of privacy so important? This relies on their best case, so I think we're already winning at this point. Let's extend our margins, because it relies on the fact that it's done very well and that it requires a lot of information to be done well. That means that it looks like you having to give your government ID, your credit card, all of that information to verify it in the very best place. This is very bad, and I'll whip it here. Firstly, but just because of things like hacks, but also because of the power asymmetry that exists in society. We tell you when the state has so much power over you and it has so much restriction on people's agencies that you should care about the things like their privacy when it literally could ruin their life and things like hacks. But I think secondly, it restricts their ability for free speech because we are thinking about actors that now don't want to make it count because they understand their government ID has to be given out. Notice that this is like a prerequisite for any kind of change because people have to be expressed themselves. That is a very bare minimum that we expect in a society that takes away so much of our agency. If you care about free speech, but even if you don't, you win on all the other actors. So proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the third speaker.
Like, within the whole AF case, I'm super confused as to where they actually make a change when they don't have these things that benefits kids on social media. I think that positive content that they listed is super vague, and I'm not really sure what it is. And I don't actually know what the incentives are on why filtering becomes worse and why this suddenly for 17 is going to be so harmful. I think that it's really not obvious where these things are. Okay, within my speech, firstly, just oh, and also I think that they pivoted really late onto this data privacy thing that they explained within the last 15 seconds of their first AF. I think that I think that their case is not really contingent on much. Okay, within my speech, a couple things. Firstly, why these like age things aren't like completely redundant. Secondly, on like what does regulations look like if social media companies do it, we think that like AFIS told us that this is like what their side looks like. We think this isn't true. And then secondly, and then thirdly, what does this look like if the government does it? Okay, why are these age regulations not redundant? I think that like, what we've heard from AFIS is that these is that like kids are gonna be like super sneaky first of all, and then secondly that they're like mega tech savvy and they're just gonna like hack their way out of it. Okay, I think that these regulations are redundant for like a few reasons. Okay, firstly on like kids being super sneaky, we think that like as we tell you at Thomas, we think that like most of these kids aren't gonna be like going and like digging around trying to find like a credit card, a passport. We think that like there is some like moral weight that this carries. Secondly, we think that like we think that we tell you that these data companies, these like third-party companies that like regulate this are going to be like pretty good at their jobs. We think that like this is their job and that they're going to be like pretty good at regulating it. Why? Because they're like contracted by the government, as we tell you at Thomas. We think that like there's like competition for these contracts. We think that's like pretty like desirable. We think that the only response that we hear to this is that like they're going to want to like suck up to Mark Zuckerberg and like get a job within Meta. We think that like they're probably more like concerned within this with like making their own company successful. We think that this is just like we think this is like inadequate. We think that like their primary incentive is like making sure that their company is effective. We think that they like don't want to lose their contract. We think it's quite obvious. Thirdly, we think that like maybe this doesn't look like putting things on the top shelf, but we just think it looks like the documents that you need really like pretty hard to find. We think that like it's like credit cards, etc. And we think that like fourthly, we think that like these parents like do care. We think that like if they don't care, then I'm not sure where the public pressure that their whole case rides on is coming from for social media companies to have regulations. We think that parents care if their kids are exposed to harmful content, and if they like don't, then I don't know where the AF case actually gets like worse filtering, because I don't know where any pressure for any regulations on these companies to be. I think this is the sole group of people that does care about like kids online. Okay. Firstly, on like what is and then like why like unlikely to be super tech savvy. I think this like much worse response to like why these are going to be redundant, because I think that like the people who work within tech companies are going to be much better at like creating like unhackable systems than like some like 12-year-old who like is working on like Scratch Junior. But I think that so therefore I think this is like very unlikely, and also I think that like most kids aren't going to be able to get around hack their way around these. I think that this response is inadequate. Okay, I'll take a point now.
In your best case, you make social media worse for the rest of society because filtering becomes worse. How do you outweigh this part?
I still don't know why filtering becomes worse, because I still don't know where the public pressure comes from for there to be any filtering in the first place if you don't have any things from governments. But I can move on. I'll move on to that. But I don't think that we could make filtering a worse place because of these great makes that we gave you at Thomas as to why there's actually no incentive under the status quo for like companies, social media companies, to do any filtering in the first place. It's because they're like money driven. It's because they like want this content to be like sensationalized. It's because they like it doesn't actually matter to them if like kids are exposed to this online, especially if you tell us that there's no public pressure. And if there is, I think that these companies are really slow at acting on it. We think that they can like have like Mark Zuckerberg have like a $1 billion lawyer that gets him out of this lawsuit. We think that's pretty redundant. We think that the government is the only way that we can do this. So therefore in terms of like this like public pressure, I think that they haven't sufficiently proven where it comes from. I think that like I'm not sure where this like filtering point comes from. I'm not sure how they get this, and I'm pretty sure that like the content that we give you, and our second point from Thomas, I think that this is actually much more substantive as to why under our side of the house we would get better filtering even if there is no ban on social media, because companies therefore have to take accountability for at least knowing that there's like a 12-year-old on their site. We think that this is great content that hasn't been responded to at all throughout down the whole line. We think that this is really important to WEP. Because we think that like even if you had the same amount of children on social media, we think that even if you have no change in the algorithms, we think that like at the point that you get like at least Facebook has to know like, yeah, I do have 12-year-olds on my site, and they have to like take accountability within like the courts. We think that within countries where this isn't banned, we think that this is great. We think that this creates more accountability on these companies. We think that it does help protect children online. Note that like under this, that like kids won't just go steal their parents' ID, because if you live in a company where Facebook isn't banned, it's like a lot of work to go steal your parents' passport. And like we think that like all the links that we give you there are like amplified there, where it's like not illegal. We think that this point is like super important. Okay, now it's like why governments can do this like really effectively. We think that primarily, we think that, primarily I think that like when you have these enforced, we think that the third-party companies that we tell you about are like likely to be really effective because of the competition, because they're wanting to have these contracts, all these reasons. We think that the government's the only people who can do this because they're able to like actively put pressure back onto these companies. We think that like when they don't comply, when they can see that their children are still on these platforms, we think that the government's the only people who can be like, hey Meta, it's not working, you need to do something more. Or like, hey third-party company, this isn't working, we need to do more. We think that this public pressure doesn't exist to the same extent, even if like 100,000 mums are like writing letters to Meta being like, can you please protect my kid? We think that the government is the only person who has unique regulations over these people. And therefore we think that like that they're the only people who are able to actually enforce regulations. I think it's unclear throughout the AFCAs where this like pressure filtering is coming from. Okay, now like quickly some response to like two other like weird pushes that they've come out with like later down the line, or that they've like jumped to. Okay, firstly on this like sudden exposure at 18, we think this is like pretty easily rebuttable. We think that like I think that this is the harms that they're trying to claim of like people getting like immediate exposure to social media at 18 and they're like absolutely screwed. We think like like you're probably more likely to have like more critical thinking skills when you're 17. Like this is not very like, we think that like the things that are like affecting kids at young ages on social media like should like essentially explicit content. I think it's okay if it's 17. We think that the harms like it's much less dramatic. Same things like body image issues online. We think that like this is bad. We also think that like if your algorithm turns into like decapitation followed by sexual content, that like people are gonna like tune out of social media. We think that there are incentives to have like a relatively engaging algorithm. And then secondly, like lastly, really quickly, on this data privacy thing, we think this is not debate winning. We think that companies already have a massive amount of our data. We think that like they don't actually like have massive harms with it. We don't think that people feel insecure online because they like click accept cookies on everything. We think that people would like already given their like IDs to like the government. We think that people aren't as worried about this. We don't think this is a debate-winning principle.
I'd like to thank for this speech, and as is customary, reverse the speaking order and invite the reply speaker from the
Edges, I think to win this debate, we have to do something very simple, and I think we've done it very well. I think we have to prove to you that a government which is accountable to its people, which has the resources of a state behind it, which has the ability to go and contract people who are very, very smart and very good at designing systems to stop kids getting into social media much better than we are at doing this. I think that you have to merely believe that a government is going to be better at doing this than public pressure is going to be able to face a social media company with billions. A social media company with a vested interest in making sure that their content is as salacious as possible. I think as soon as you believe that a government is going to be even marginally better at achieving its goals than this public pressure, you have to live this debate to neck. Okay, 4 things in my leaders. Very quickly on data privacy, then 3 main points of clash for you. Firstly, what do we think the implementation of government regulation looks like? Secondly, the social pressure on companies. And then thirdly, this idea of kids suddenly getting exposed to social media at 18. Firstly, on data privacy. Note that I think this principle simply doesn't stand when you understand, as we've told you, there are lots of times when we are willing to give up our privacy, like, very willingly. This looks like just clicking cookies on a site because it takes 3 seconds more to say no. And this probably tells you people don't care about it a lot. I think also it's very clear that we already give up a lot of our privacy. But I don't even think that matters, because I think it's clear that there are lots of times when we give up our privacy because it is for a good cause, right? I think the government collects a bunch of data on us, collects a bunch of statistics, and we're fine with that in the census because we realize that it's for a good purpose. I think that people are very happy to give up some of their data if it's going to have a positive outcome on their kids, if it's going to have a positive outcome on other people. I don't think this principle stands in this debate. Okay. Secondly, then, on implementation of government regulation. I think we've told you that governments, once they do a policy, want to do it well. I think we've told you this because they're accountable to the people. I mean, you believe now that they have to at least do it, like, basically well, so they don't look embarrassing in front of the people who have to vote them in again in 3 years. Note also that I think doing this policy well probably doesn't have a major fiscal cost to the government, which means there's nothing really stopping them going to find the best possible version of this policy to implement, going to hire people who have lots of, like, know-how to do this. Note that we've also explained to you that this massive lobbying from the tech sector probably doesn't exist anywhere other than the USA, because there is nowhere else where the tech companies have so much power, have so much money, have so many jobs in the economy which they can use to, like, pull off. Okay. I think this therefore means that we have the ability to find people who are going to implement this well. I think we've told you a bunch of reasons why they're going to do well. Even if you believe that these have been negated a lot by AF, you still probably have to believe that there is a lot of marginal change or something creating friction in the system. There are a bunch of kids who never get onto social media for a long time. There are a bunch of kids who stop using it. Okay. So I'll weigh this up in a second. But thirdly now on social pressure on companies. Look. I don't think this has been very well explained, but looking at it in its most charitable form, I think the F case is that suddenly now there is a massive more amount of social pressure because people cannot simply look at these age verification systems and say that these are doing all the work. No, but I think this inherently scales with the effectiveness of the limitations. That means if that we have incredibly ineffective verification systems, then people probably know this. They probably see news stories about how everyone is getting through all of these loopholes. I think this means that they don't get any of the social pressure. I think on the other hand, if our systems are incredibly effective, then probably they do get some of the social pressure change, but even then our content is easily able to outweigh that, because I think that getting people off social media is just so much more important than doing this filtering. Why? Because I think that filtering is always really hard and is always really bad, as I told you all the way back at first, right? Because filtering content is just very, very difficult. So we told you it's a fine that people find ways to get around it. We told you that in the status quo filtering is already not great. I think this means that the only way to protect people is to get them off social media. I think that we uniquely managed to do that. I think we win this debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the reply speaker from the affirming team to conclude it.
They can't just flip our point on better filtering, because with age verification, everyone just assumes that kids are stopped. Creators don't know that the 42-year-old in their comments is actually just a tech-savvy demon from Gen Alpha. Stand with side affirming. 3 things in my reply today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about efficacy. Secondly, on safety. And lastly, I'm going to whip our incredibly nicely crafted principle. So now let's talk about efficacy. You know, if it needs to prove why efficacy, needs to prove efficacy in order to prove any of their singular impacts, right? I have to flag here, this debate was never solely about credit cards. Read the info slide. It also looks like estimation technology. We never actually got any clarification on what they had to stand for here. They cannot just sit behind one example. 1, they never proved their model. Note here, they use their model as one of their key mechanisms to explaining why age verification is done well, right? And we give you pushback at Krisha and Hamish. We explain to you why companies are rich and politically powerful all over the world. Hamish tells you they just own their verification verification companies they have, right? This means then none of their mechanisms on like these companies having competition actually stand in the first place. And what this analysis does for our case is one, it disproves their main mechanism behind efficacy. They cannot just hide behind their modeling. And two, even if you believe our framing that like social media companies implement their own verification mechanisms and like all the harms I gave you at first with poor incentives still stand. But three, even if you believe their model, they never scaled their impacts of how many kids you actually get off of social media. Maybe some kids whose parents have particularly well hidden credit cards get like better social media experiences and just do not access social media. Know here that there are always going to be kids that slip through the cracks. They never actually explain to you what happens to those kids. We tell you they're exposed to a terrible version of the internet that's not going to protect them. They're going to be exposed to things like child pornography. That is absolutely awful. We do not want our kids looking at this stuff. Okay, now let's talk about how efficacy is achieved on our comparative. Because down the line, we explain to you why there are incentives for the government that are largely symmetric, but the capacity was never symmetric, right? Because both sides concede your government probably isn't going to do a great job at age verification. That is why they model in the fact that this is done by private companies, right? But comparatively, we can just say hate speech bad. Let's ban that. Like, we do not like sexually explicit content. Let's ban it as well. I gave you analysis on why our model was incredibly exclusive and why we can only get better benefits of having better social media on outside the house. Notably, even if they prove that their model is effective to some extent, this debate was always comparative. They needed to prove why the efficacy on their side of the house outweighs efficacy on ours. It's too late. I'm the last speech. It can't be done anymore. Now that I want to talk about safety, right? Because even if all three of us have failed our model, even if they win the efficacy point, they cannot win this debate by just proving that some kids get off social media. Because we can just outweigh them with our positive case, right? One, Christian and I prove why safety guidelines and algorithm regulations are so much better on outside the house, right? There's public accountability, there's government incentives, so they can't just dismiss public pressure without disproving our mechanisms on why this actually exists in the first place. Two, even if we get a lot more kids online, we explain to you why they're just safer in general, right? We told you that it takes a lot of fiat to just ban social media. We can do this regulation really well. But three, Hamish scales these impacts of safety. He explains to you literally everyone on social media has a better experience. Stand for less echo chamber radicalism, stand for less sexually explicit racist content on social media. Lastly and briefly, I'm going to talk about our amazing principle. Because no here they keep dismissing our principle, explaining how this information is symmetric. We explained to you down the line. I spent a good minute explaining that the information given up on their side of the house is concealed on the comparative. It is your identity, it is your race, it is your credit card details, things that you would not manually enter on our side of the house when this verification doesn't exist. How do we weigh this principle? Because even if everything is a wash, this is exactly what we went on. One, notice how when this information is out there, you can never withdraw it. You weigh on irreversibility. Two, it is just incredibly difficult of opting out of giving this information. I gave you the structural reasons at first, explaining there's the power is asymmetry. It is just hard to opt out of a key way of communication. Everyone and their mums is on social media. If you believe that this whole debate is a wash, by our principle.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech and all speakers for thoroughly enjoying the debate. I invite you to sworn to take hands, and I'll ask if everyone could please leave the room. Who's there?